What if the very culture we celebrate is the same one that's keeping us from rising? Thomas Sowell didn't just ask that question, he answered it. And people have been dodging the truth ever since. He's a man many admire and many fear. Thomas Sowell, economist, historian, firebrand intellectual, born in the Jim Crow South, raised in Harlem, and forged in the fires of personal struggle, Sowell didn't just study poverty. He lived it. And when he looked around at the modern black experience, he said something most people were too afraid to whisper. The problem isn't just racism. It's culture. Wait, what? You heard that right. According to Sowell, systemic racism is real, but so is something more subtle, more taboo, a set of self-defeating habits passed down like a virus, habits that some call culture, but Sowell calls chains. And here's the twist. What we now call black culture, the slang, the defiance, the glorification of struggle, might not even be ours to begin with. It's a culture we inherited not from Africa, but from the white redneck South. Thomas Sowell, black rednecks and white liberals. That's not a hot take. That's an explosion in the conversation. So, how did we get here? How did a brilliant black man become one of the most controversial voices in black America? How did we go from freedom fighters to fighting each other over who's acting white? And more importantly, was he right? To understand Sowell's argument, we need to rewind history. Because this isn't just about sociology or statistics. It's about identity. Let's start with Harlem. 1940s, young Thomas Sowell dropped out of high school working minimum wage jobs. Just trying to survive. No father, no safety net. Just hustle. But this isn't a sob story. Sowell would go on to the Ivy League, work with Nobel economists, and publish over 30 books. He's been called the smartest man in America, and maybe the most dangerous. Because when Sowell looked at rising dropout rates, sky-high crime, and generational poverty, he didn't just point fingers at white supremacy. He pointed fingers at us, at broken homes, at a celebration of victimhood, at a rejection of education, at a culture, he argues, that has become addicted to dysfunction. Controversial? Absolutely. But here's the kicker. He didn't say this to shame black people. He said it to free them. Because according to Sowell, if culture is a problem, then culture can change. Let's be clear. Sowell never denied racism. He lived it, felt it, and fought it. But he also believed that focusing only on external enemies meant ignoring the internal ones, the ones that live in our habits. Our language, our expectations. The worst thing you can do, Sowell said, is believe that your fate is out of your hands. That belief that we are forever victims is what he calls a new plantation. And he says we've been trained to live on it. Now here's where things get real. Sowell's most explosive idea is this, that many traits celebrated as authentically black in America, aggressive speech, anti-authority attitudes, resistance to book learning, aren't African at all. They're relics of white southern redneck culture, a culture of pride, violence, and suspicion of institutions that dates back centuries and that enslaved Africans absorbed by force. What's called ghetto culture didn't come from Africa. It came from the worst parts of rural white society. Thomas Sowell. Is that hard to hear? Yes, but if it's true, it changes everything. Because it means that what we call our culture may actually be someone else's poison, passed down through generations of oppression. And that's where Sowell breaks the mold. He's not saying black people are broken. He's saying we've been tricked into adopting behaviors that don't serve us and calling that culture. Behaviors like glorifying rebellion over reason, shaming intelligence as acting white, tolerating chaos over structure, valuing street cred over stability. Sowell says these habits were never African. They were adopted under survival conditions. And now they're being celebrated, not challenged. And while politicians talk about equity, Sowell asks a different question. What kind of culture produces success? Because somebody's getting rich in America. Somebody's building businesses, graduating, innovating, thriving. And according to Sowell, success leaves clues. If we want better outcomes, he says, we can't just fight oppression. We have to fight within. And that's the message no one wants to hear. But is there evidence? Are there examples? What about the black communities in the 1940s and 50s that had lower crime, higher marriage rates, and better literacy, even under segregation? What happened? And what do immigrant black families from Africa, the Caribbean, or Haiti prove when they succeed faster than native-born black Americans? Are they better? No, but maybe, just maybe, their culture is different. And that changes the conversation. This isn't about respectability politics. It's about results. Because if we want to break the cycle, Sowell says we need to stop blaming the mirror and start changing the reflection. But is that fair? Is Sowell overlooking structural oppression? Or is he exposing an inconvenient truth? Because what he says next made even his allies back away.
The average of black kid today, I think, is probably better off, certainly materially, than, say, Ben Carson was when he was growing up.
Ben Carson, the famous
black
surgeon at Johns Hopkins.
Right.
Who is immensely accomplished in every way.
Yes.
Right.
I would say that certainly the black kids who are growing up today have a higher material standard of living than I had. The difference was that the schools were good when I came along. They were especially good in New York at that time, hard as that is to believe. But the kids who grew up in that same place where I lived, they will not get that same education. Now that can be blamed on somebody, but it has very little to do with what happened 100 or 200 years ago. And it's true in other countries. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, there's a tribe, the Igbos, who are living in one of the least fertile parts of Nigeria, who were in fact enslaved in centuries past by other tribes and so on. When the British moved in and set up schools, the Igbos went for the schools. By the time Nigeria became independent, the Igbos had climbed above the other groups that had been ahead of them to begin with. But there are all kinds of cross currents of factors, the particular culture, or the particular geography. You run through the whole list of them.
You cite, in Intellectuals and Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist, James Flynn, that just stopped me cold. After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women. And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all. The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quoting Intellectuals and Race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations. Is this
No, the expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had...
There's no gangster rap that was pervasively available in Germany.
So here's what I'm getting. There is something about black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back?
Yes. In fact, I went into this in a previous book on which about black rednecks and white liberals, because that same subculture.
Let's talk about two of your books here. Go ahead.
Because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
All right. And so whose job is it to say, wrong subculture, folks, you're harming yourselves?
Well, I would think in an ideal world that intellectuals might take on that task, but the world that we live in, I've noticed, is not ideal.
All right. What is to be done? take a look at President Lyndon Johnson speaking at Howard University in 1965.
Oh, yeah.
But freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair.
It's pathetic. It's not a question of, there's no you who has the control to be completely fair or completely unfair. I mean, the circumstances are, so someone once criticized the mental tests on grounds that the tests were unfair. And I think it was David Reisman who said, the tests are not unfair, life is unfair, and the tests are measuring the results. But who has control of life? Who has control of the past? Who has control of the culture that people have in the present, which they've inherited from the past?
So Lyndon Johnson, in fact, although good liberal that he was, at least in regard, Lyndon Johnson had a complicated career and changed positions on issues many times. But good liberal though he was at that moment, he was in fact engaging in a breathtaking arrogance.
Yes.
On two counts. One, that white people were the ones who were responsible for where black people stood in the race, that it was up to whites entirely. That blacks, as he described, I'm
devastating.
The black people are passive, they're acted upon.
That's right, that's right.
And then the second act of arrogance is the supposition that somehow the federal government could fix it.
Yes, it is staggering. But if you wanted to be charitable, you could say, well, he said this in 1965. But if you say, all right, why are people now repeating it in 2013 when we've had nearly half a century of experience to the contrary? And if you look within the black community, those blacks who had escaped what I call the black redneck culture, they've moved on. So, but it's the culture the different parts of the black community had. They were different.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in his famous 1965 report entitled "The Negro Family: The Case for National Action," close quote. Longish quotation, but it gets to something, I believe. Moynihan, the fundamental problem is that of family structure. The Negro family in the urban ghettos is crumbling. A middle class has managed to save itself, but for vast numbers of the unskilled and poorly educated, the fabric of conventional social relationships has all but disintegrated. So long as this situation persists, the cycle of poverty and disadvantage will continue to repeat itself, close quote. When Moynihan wrote those words, the illegitimacy rate among African Americans was 25%. Today, the illegitimacy rate among white Americans is 36%. Among Hispanics, more than 50%, and among African Americans, more than 70%.
Yeah.
Aside from throwing up your hands in despair, what is to be done?
The first thing to be done is to understand that this was a result of policies begun in the 1960s. This is not a legacy of what happened 100 years before the 1960s.
The breakdown of the black family is not a legacy of slavery.
No, if you the classic study of this goes all the way back to the era of slavery, and they find that most black kids, even under slavery, had lived with two parents, and that was true all the way up until the 1960s. And so, if you really want to find out what's changed, it has changed since the 1960s. And the fact that whites now have a higher rate of illegitimacy than blacks had when Moynihan wrote suggests that this is something that spreads out. But if you look at something else, if you look at those blacks, look at black husband-wife families, the poverty rate among such families has been in single digits every year since 1994. And so if you look at the external causes, why the husband and wife families and the welfare single mom families all are facing the same society and objective things, but the results are radically different because the cultures and values are different.
So you would roll back welfare. I guess that's the principal policy. So what would Tom Sowell do? One, you'd eliminate welfare, you'd reform welfare. What would you do?
Roll it back.
All right. And what about affirmative action?
Eliminate it.
Just gone.
Yeah.
Colorblind
Yeah.
policy completely. All right. What prospect for that do you see?
None.
No
At
black,
present.
no black leader of any standing. I'm talking about a political leader as opposed to an intellectual such
Right.
as yourself. You've got, well, there's you, there's Walter Williams. Do you get the sense that there's a growing generation, a rising generation of African American intellectuals who say, enough of this, I'm with Tom Sowell?
Well, I don't know if they'll go that far. There's no point.
That would be asking a lot.
There's no point being reckless. But I think there are people like Shelby Steele and many others, Larry Elder. You can run through a long list, and there are more such people now than there were, say, in the 1970s. But in terms of political leaders, all the incentives politically are for black leaders to blame all problems in the black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the black community against enemies, which in turn creates the situation in which many blacks don't feel that anything that they do is going to help themselves unless it's done politically as a group. That there's no point. I mean, why would you, if you believe what they say, why would you want to knock yourself out in school knowing that the man is not going to let you get anywhere? Well, one of the most pathetic things I heard in recent years was a young black man saying that, at one point he thought he would join the Air Force and become a pilot. And then he says he realized that the white man is not going to let a black man become a pilot. And he was saying this decades after the Tennessee Airmen had established their reputation in combat in Europe. But the hopelessness is one of the big products of the race industry. That you have no chance. I remember giving a talk at Marquette, and at the end of the talk, among the questions that was asked, a young black man got up and he said, "Even though I am graduating from Marquette University, what hope is there for me?" And having gone through college when I was in the 50s, I don't remember any blacks saying that in the 1950s, when there was a lot more obstacles to overcome than there were when this guy is graduating from Marquette. But you have to produce that kind of feeling in order to serve the interests of those in the race industry.
Final question then. Maybe we can think in terms of that young man at Marquette. Or let's put it this way. Somewhere watching this interview, there's a young Thomas Sowell. There's an African American who's smart and wants to do something with his life. It seems to me we've already got one piece of advice you'd offer to him is stay away from the racist industry. Stay away from the race hustlers. What advice would you give a young Thomas Sowell? How do you make something of yourself as an African American in America today?
The way anybody else would.
When you're told
You
your
equip
struggle
yourself with
is your
skills.
identity, what happens when the struggle ends? That's the final question Thomas Sowell dares to ask. Because for him, the greatest tragedy isn't oppression. It's addiction to oppression. And now, decades after he first made these claims, the evidence is mounting and the silence is deafening. Because here's what's not being taught in schools. Here's what's not debated on the news. And here's what makes Sowell more dangerous than ever. He didn't just write books. He made predictions. And those predictions, they're coming true. Let's rewind to the 1980s. Sowell warned that dependency on government programs would destroy the black family, that welfare would incentivize fatherlessness, that culture, once rooted in survival, would be rebranded as identity, and that millions would confuse defiance with power while falling deeper into poverty. People called him an Uncle Tom. But here we are, in cities across America. Fatherless homes are the norm. Reading levels have dropped. Test scores have plummeted. Homicide rates in majority black neighborhoods remain tragically high, not due to skin color, but due to the erosion of structure. And still we celebrate the culture. The same culture Sowell says is eating us alive. He wasn't alone. Black leaders like Malcolm X warned against cultural traps disguised as freedom. Booker T. Washington, Zora Neale Hurston, even W.B. Du Bois, many of them urged the community to rise through education, not around it, through discipline, through order, through building. But today, street is celebrated, intelligence is mocked, disrespect is monetized, and trauma is branded. The very traits Sowell identified as cultural shackles have now been turned into entertainment, into music, into memes, into billion-dollar industries. And we've mistaken all of it for empowerment. Sowell once said, "When people get used to preferential treatment, equal treatment seems like discrimination." That quote hit like a bullet, and it still does, because it challenges the core of today's narrative, that we need saving, that we need fixing, that we are owed, not capable. But what if we are capable? What if we stopped begging for access and started building our own doors? That's the revolution Sowell called for, not protest in the street, but transformation in the mind. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to wake us up. Because while politicians offer empty promises, Sowell offered a mirror. And not everyone liked what they saw. But here's the catch. Agreeing with Sowell doesn't mean denying racism exists. It means acknowledging something even harder. That culture matters more than policies. That mindset shapes destiny. That values, passed down from family, community, and tradition, are stronger than government checks or celebrity slogans. And when Sowell looked at the black community, he didn't see victims. He saw potential, wasted potential. And that's the heartbreak. Because when he visited thriving black immigrant communities, from Nigerian Americans to Haitian entrepreneurs, he saw proof, not of superiority, but of possibility. Proof that black excellence isn't hypothetical. It's real, but it's not tied to color. It's tied to culture. And culture is a choice. So here's where we leave it. Not with blame, not with shame, but with a question that could change everything. What if the most revolutionary thing a black person can do in America today is not to protest the system, but to transform the culture? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Agree? Disagree? Either way, the real power is in the conversation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because next time we dive into how the media hijacked the black narrative and who's really profiting from the pain.